Our father's caregiver thought she'd won the lottery when Dad got diagnosed with dementia, but she got her biggest karma. 6 months ago, we hired Diane through an agency to help Dad with daily tasks after his mild stroke. He could still walk and talk, but needed help with medications and doctor appointments. My brother Victor and I both worked full-time and needed someone reliable. Diane had glowing references, 15 years of experience, seemed genuinely caring. Dad liked her immediately, said she reminded him of our mother who'd passed 3 years prior. We thought we'd found the perfect solution. Within weeks, Diane started overstepping. Rearranged all Dad's furniture without asking, said the feng shui was better for his recovery. Threw out Mom's things from the bedroom, claiming they were dust collectors affecting his breathing. Started cooking elaborate meals and insisting we weren't invited because Dad needed calm dining experiences. When we'd visit, she'd hover constantly, interrupting our conversations to remind Dad to take pills he'd already taken or rest when he wasn't tired. Then came the isolation tactics. She convinced Dad his friends were too exhausting for his heart. Told him Victor and I only visited to check on our inheritance. Said the neighbors gossiped about him being weak. Within 2 months, Dad barely left his room when we visited. Seemed confused and distant. Diane would speak for him, saying he'd had a bad night or wasn't feeling conversational. We tried talking to Dad alone, but Diane always had an excuse why she needed to be present. Said he got agitated without her, might fall, could forget important medical information. 3 months in, Dad started showing serious confusion. Couldn't remember our names sometimes. Talked about Mom like she was alive. Accused us of stealing things that were right in front of him. Diane said the stroke had triggered dementia, that the doctors warned her this might happen. We hadn't heard anything from his doctors, but when we called, they said Diane handled all communications now as Dad's primary caregiver with medical power of attorney. We never authorized that. Demanded to see the paperwork, and Diane produced documents with Dad's shaky signature, giving her complete control over his medical decisions. The lawyer said it looked legitimate, that if Dad was competent when he signed it, we couldn't contest it. Diane started limiting our visits to once a week, then every 2 weeks, saying Dad got too confused with too many people around. She moved into the house full-time, said Dad needed round-the-clock care, started calling herself his girlfriend, then fiancé, posting photos on social media of her wearing Mom's jewelry that she'd supposedly thrown away. We tried getting Adult Protective Services involved, but Dad told them he was happy, that Diane took excellent care of him, that his children were jealous of his new relationship. The social worker said there was no evidence of abuse, that Dad seemed well cared for, that older people had the right to make their own choices even if their children disagreed. Last month, Diane announced they were getting married. Said Dad had proposed during a moment of clarity that he didn't want to die alone. The ceremony would be private, immediate family not invited because we'd been so unsupportive. She'd already gotten Dad to sign a new will leaving her everything, saying his children had abandoned him in his time of need. Victor hired a private investigator out of desperation. What he found changed everything. Diane had done this twice before, in different states, targeting elderly men with recent strokes. Both men had developed sudden dementia. Both had married her quickly. Both had died within a year, leaving her everything. The families had suspected foul play but couldn't prove anything. The investigator also discovered Diane was putting something in Dad's food. Had photos of her crushing pills that weren't his prescribed medications. We didn't know what they were, but the investigator said certain combinations of psychiatric drugs could mimic dementia symptoms perfectly. We couldn't go to the police without proof the pills were harmful, and getting Dad tested required Diane's consent as his medical power of attorney. So we got creative. Victor's wife Ellen was a pharmaceutical rep, knew exactly which drug combinations would cause Dad's symptoms. We invited Diane to lunch to discuss the wedding peacefully, said we wanted to apologize and be supportive. While she was gone, Ellen and I searched the house. Found the pills hidden in a vitamin bottle in Diane's room. They were antipsychotics mixed with sedatives, exactly what Ellen suspected. We replaced them with identical-looking vitamins, then installed tiny cameras in Dad's room and kitchen. Within 4 days, Dad's confusion started clearing. The cameras caught everything over the next week. Diane crushed pills into Dad's morning oatmeal every single day, grinding them with the back of a spoon until they were powder. She checked over her shoulder each time even though she thought she was alone. Then she'd stir the powder into his food until it disappeared completely. I watched her do the same thing with his afternoon smoothie, crushing pills on the kitchen counter and mixing them in while the blender ran. At dinner, she'd drop crushed pills into his tea while his back was turned. My stomach twisted watching her poison my father 3 times a day with such careful planning. She was so careful about it, so practiced, like she'd done this 1,000 times before. Victor and I took turns watching the footage because neither of us could handle seeing it all at once. Ellen had to leave the room twice because watching someone methodically drug an elderly man made her physically sick. But we needed to document everything, so we saved every single clip showing Diane crushing those pills. Dad's change over those days was incredible and sad at the same time. By day 6, he asked Diane where his reading glasses were using a complete sentence. She froze halfway through responding because he hadn't spoken that clearly in months. You could see the panic flash across her face on the camera footage. She recovered quickly and told him they were on the side table, but her hands shook when she handed them to him. By day 8, Dad asked why Victor and I hadn't visited lately. Diane scrambled to make excuses about us being busy with work, her voice getting higher and faster. Dad just nodded slowly, but he looked confused about why his own kids would be too busy to visit. The cameras caught Diane pacing in the kitchen after that conversation, chewing her nails and checking her phone over and over. She knew something was wrong, but couldn't figure out what. We met with Prudence Hassan the following Tuesday morning at her office downtown. Darren had recommended her specifically because she handled elder abuse cases and knew how to build solid legal cases. Prudence was a small woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that didn't miss anything. She reviewed everything we brought, the pills we'd found and replaced, the photos Darren took of Diane crushing medication, the camera footage showing her drugging Dad 3 times daily, the investigator's full report about Diane's previous victims in other states. Prudence watched the footage without saying anything for the first few minutes. Then she leaned back in her chair and told us we had a really strong case, but needed to move carefully to avoid legal problems. And she explained that confronting Diane directly could be considered entrapment or messing with evidence if we handled it wrong. We needed to involve the authorities first and let them collect the evidence officially. Victor started to argue that we should just throw Diane out immediately, but Prudence cut him off. She said she understood the urge, but doing that could ruin the criminal case against Diane. We had to resist that urge no matter how good it would feel. The evidence had to be collected properly by police with warrants and official procedures. Otherwise, Diane's lawyer could get everything thrown out of court. Prudence picked up her phone right there in the meeting and called someone named Detective Shirley Flores with the Police Elder Abuse Unit. She explained the situation briefly and said she had clients who needed to meet as soon as possible. Detective Flores agreed to meet with us the next morning at the police station. Prudence told us that Shirley had handled caregiver cases before and knew exactly how these predators worked. The isolation tactics, the fake medical problems, the rushed legal documents, the quick marriage before anyone could stop it. Shirley had seen it all and knew what to look for. We arrived at the police station at 8 the next morning with all our evidence in a large folder. Detective Flores met us in a small conference room with gray walls and a table that had seen better days. She was a tall woman with dark hair pulled back tight and eyes that looked tired but focused. We showed her everything. She watched the camera footage on Victor's laptop with an expression that started out professional and neutral. But as the footage continued showing Diane crushing pills and stirring them into Dad's food day after day, her jaw got tighter and tighter. By the end, she was gripping the edge of the table hard enough that her knuckles turned white. She told us she'd seen plenty of elder abuse in her 15 years on the job. But watching someone drug a stroke victim on purpose to fake dementia while planning to marry him for his money hit different from other cases. She said this was one of the clearest cases she'd ever seen, because we had actual video evidence of the crime happening. Most elder abuse cases relied on testimony and circumstantial evidence, but we had Diane on camera poisoning Dad. Detective Flores made several phone calls while we waited in the conference room. She came back 30 minutes later and said she had a warrant approved for the next afternoon. We worked out a coordinated plan right there. Detective Flores and 2 uniformed officers would arrive at Dad's house with the warrant while Diane was giving Dad his afternoon medication. We'd time it perfectly so they'd catch her in the act if possible. Victor and I would stay away from the house until after the arrest to avoid any appearance of us tipping off the police. The next afternoon felt like the longest day of my life. Victor and I sat in my car 3 blocks from Dad's house waiting for Detective Flores to call. My phone finally rang at 2:15. Detective Flores said they were moving in and we should stay back for another 30 minutes. We drove to a coffee shop and pretended to drink coffee we couldn't taste. My phone rang again 40 minutes later. Detective Flores said we could come to the house now. When we pulled up, there were 2 police cars in the driveway with lights flashing. Neighbors stood in their yards watching everything. We went inside and found Detective Flores in the kitchen with 2 uniformed officers. They had evidence bags spread across the counter. The vitamin bottle with the hidden pills sat in one bag already tagged and labeled. Another bag held the pills Diane had been crushing that afternoon. A third bag had the mortar and pestle she used to grind them. Officers were photographing everything in the kitchen, taking pictures of the counter, the drawers, the cabinets. One officer was in Dad's room installing official cameras to replace our hidden ones. Dad sat in his chair in the living room looking confused, but way more alert than he'd been in months. He kept asking what was happening and why police were in his house. An officer stood near him explaining gently that they were collecting evidence. Dad asked clear, direct questions about what kind of evidence and why they needed it. His sentences were complete, and his thoughts were organized. It was like watching him come back to life. Diane sat on the couch with her hands behind her back already in handcuffs. Her face had changed completely from the sweet caregiver act she always put on. Now she just looked cold and calculating, her eyes moving around the room like she was planning her next move. Detective Flores stood in front of her reading her rights from a small card. Diane was arrested for elder abuse, fraud, and giving harmful substances without a medical license. As Detective Flores read each charge, Diane's expression got harder and meaner. When the detective finished, Diane said she wanted her lawyer and wouldn't say anything else. Her voice was flat and emotionless, nothing like the caring, concerned tone she used around Dad. The two uniformed officers lifted Diane off the couch and walked her toward the front door. She didn't fight or argue, just walked with her head up like she was going somewhere normal instead of to jail. Neighbors watched from their yards as the officers put Diane in the back of a police car. Mrs. Kim from next door had her hand over her mouth. Mr. Rodriguez was filming everything on his phone. Part of me felt good seeing Diane led away in handcuffs after months of watching her hurt Dad. But mostly I just felt exhausted relief that Dad was finally safe from her. Victor stood next to me on the front porch with his arm around my shoulders. We watched the police car pull away with Diane in the back seat. Then we turned and walked into our father's house freely for the first time in months. Dad sat in his living room chair looking around like he didn't recognize his own house. He kept asking where Diane went and whether she was coming back to make his dinner. His words were clearer than they'd been in months, but his thoughts were still jumbled and confused. The drugs were still working their way out of his system, and he didn't understand yet what had really happened. He asked why police were in his house and what they wanted with Diane. We tried explaining gently that Diane had been hurting him, but he shook his head and said Diane took good care of him. Said she made sure he took his medicine and helped him with everything. The cognitive dissonance of watching him defend the woman who'd been poisoning him was almost unbearable. Ellen sat with Dad while Victor and I drove to the police station to give our official statements. Detective Flores met us in a small interview room with recording equipment and had us walk through everything from the beginning. How we hired Diane 6 months ago after Dad's stroke. How she gradually isolated him from family and friends. How she got medical power of attorney and changed his will. How the private investigator found her pattern of targeting elderly men. How we discovered the pills and replaced them with vitamins. How we installed cameras and caught her crushing pills into Dad's food 3 times a day. Detective Flores recorded everything and had us sign written statements. She explained that Diane would likely make bail within a day or two since she had no official criminal record. The previous victims never pressed charges, so legally she looked clean. But there would be a restraining order keeping her at least 500 feet from Dad at all times. She'd also have GPS monitoring so they'd know if she tried to violate it. The DA was reviewing all the charges and considering adding attempted murder given that the drug combinations could have killed Dad. The antipsychotics mixed with sedatives at those doses could cause respiratory failure or cardiac arrest in elderly patients. Detective Flores said they were contacting the previous victims' families to see if they'd provide statements about Diane's pattern. If they could prove she'd done this before, it would strengthen the case significantly. We left the station 3 hours later feeling exhausted, but relieved that the legal process was finally moving forward. The next morning, we started interviewing nurses from a different agency. This time, we ran extensive background checks ourselves, called references, and spoke to actual people. Verified every single detail of their work history. We weren't taking any chances after what happened with Diane. The agency sent over 5 candidates and we interviewed each one carefully. The 4th nurse was a woman named Nancy, who'd been working in elder care for 20 years. She had genuine references we verified, a clean background check, and a warm but professional manner. When we explained what had happened with Diane, Nancy looked horrified. She said she'd heard of caregivers exploiting elderly clients, but never anything this calculated and cruel. She promised to help Dad recover properly, and said she'd follow whatever protocols we needed to feel safe. We hired her to come 4 hours a day to help Dad with meals and medications until he was fully stable. Prudence met with us that afternoon to discuss the legal strategy. She'd already drafted emergency petitions to void both the medical power of attorney and the new will. The petitions argued both documents were obtained through fraud and undue influence while Dad was drugged and couldn't make informed decisions. She filed them with the court that same day and requested an emergency hearing. The judge reviewed the evidence including the pills, the camera footage, and the police reports. He granted temporary orders freezing all of Dad's assets, so Diane couldn't access any accounts or make any transactions. He also restored Victor and me as Dad's healthcare proxies until a full hearing could be scheduled. Prudence said the temporary orders were a good sign that the judge saw merit in our case. Dad's improvement continued rapidly now that he was completely off Diane's drug cocktail. By day 12, he recognized both Victor and me clearly when we visited. He called us by name without hesitation and asked specific questions about what had happened to him. We sat down with him and explained everything as gently as we could. Told him about the private investigator finding Diane's previous victims, about discovering the pills she was hiding in a vitamin bottle, about replacing them with actual vitamins and watching him improve, about the cameras catching her crushing pills into his food 3 times a day, about her arrest and the charges she was facing. We watched his face cycle through confusion as he tried to process the information, then disbelief as he insisted Diane wouldn't do that to him, then anger as the reality started sinking in, then finally devastation as he understood how completely he'd been manipulated. He sat there in silence for several minutes, just staring at his hands. Then he asked in a quiet voice if Diane had ever cared about him at all, or if everything was a lie from the beginning. Victor told him the truth, that the investigator found she'd done this twice before to other men, that it was always the same pattern of isolation, drugging, quick marriage, and inheritance, that she was a predator who targeted vulnerable elderly men for their money. Dad broke down crying when he fully understood that Diane never cared about him, that everything was a calculated scheme to steal his money and probably eventually kill him like she'd done to the others. Victor and I held him while he sobbed. He wasn't just grieving the betrayal, but the lost months, the damaged relationships with his friends, the humiliation of being so thoroughly fooled. He kept saying he felt like an idiot for believing her lies and trusting her so completely. We reassured him that Diane was a professional con artist who'd refined her techniques over years and multiple victims, that she specifically targeted him because he was vulnerable after his stroke and Mom's death, that none of this was his fault. But watching our proud father confront how vulnerable he'd become was brutal. He'd always been independent and capable, and now he felt weak and foolish. The next day, we took Dad to see a neurologist that Prudence recommended. The doctor ran a full cognitive assessment and ordered brain scans. When the results came back, the neurologist confirmed that Dad's cognitive issues were entirely drug-induced, not actual dementia. His brain scans showed no significant damage beyond the original mild stroke effects. The doctor explained that the combination of antipsychotics and sedatives Diane had been giving him created symptoms that perfectly mimicked dementia: confusion, memory loss, personality changes, difficulty with language and reasoning. But none of it was permanent brain damage. With proper care and time off the drugs, Dad should recover most of his baseline cognitive function. The psychological trauma would take longer to heal, but physically his brain was fine. Dad cried again when he heard this, but this time from relief. He'd been terrified that he was losing his mind permanently. 3 days after her arrest, Diane had her bail hearing. Victor and I attended to see what would happen. Diane's lawyer argued she wasn't a flight risk and had no prior criminal record. He conveniently ignored the previous victims who never pressed charges, made her sound like a devoted caregiver who'd been falsely accused by jealous children. The prosecutor presented the evidence, including the pills, the camera footage, and the investigator's report on her pattern. The judge set bail at $50,000, which seemed low given the severity of the charges. But within 2 hours, Diane's family apparently posted the full amount, and she was released. She had to wear a GPS monitor and follow a restraining order keeping her away from Dad. We watched her walk out of the courthouse and felt sick knowing she was free. Over the next week, we reached out to Dad's friends and explained what had happened. Most of them were shocked and angry that Diane had manipulated them too. Lara arrived at Dad's house the next day nearly in tears when she saw him alert and conversational. She hugged him and apologized for believing Diane's lies about Dad wanting space from his friends. Dad reassured her that none of this was her fault, while clearly struggling with shame about being deceived. Lara told him about how Diane had called her months ago saying Dad was too tired for visitors, how she'd made it sound like seeing friends were exhausting his heart. Lara felt terrible for not pushing back or checking with us directly. Meanwhile, Prudence was reviewing Dad's financial accounts to assess the full damage. What she found made us furious. Diane had gotten Dad to add her name to his checking account back when he was heavily drugged. She'd been paying herself extra caregiver fees beyond her agency salary, sometimes $2,000 or $3,000 at a time. She'd also used Dad's credit cards to purchase expensive items including jewelry, designer handbags, and electronics. The total theft amounted to nearly $30,000 over 6 months. Prudence documented everything and added financial exploitation charges to the growing list. We knew we'd probably never recover all the money, but at least it strengthened the criminal case against her. 2 weeks later, the district attorney filed formal charges against Diane: elder abuse, fraud, theft, practicing medicine without a license, and 2 counts of attempted murder based on the drug combinations she'd been giving Dad. The prosecutor explained that the previous victims' families were cooperating now, providing statements and documentation about similar patterns in those cases. They were building a case showing Diane had done this multiple times across different states, always targeting vulnerable elderly men with recent strokes. The attempted murder charges came from the pharmacist's testimony about the specific drug combinations Diane had requested, which could have killed Dad if she'd continued long enough. If convicted on all counts, she was looking at 15 to 20 years minimum in state prison. The DA seemed confident about the case given the camera footage, the pills, and the pattern evidence. Prudence called 3 days later saying Diane's lawyer wanted to discuss a plea deal. Diane was offering to plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for testimony about how she obtained the drugs and whether anyone at the caregiving agency had helped her target vulnerable clients. The prosecutor was interested because they suspected Diane had accomplices who helped her identify and access potential victims through the agency's client database. Prudence wanted to know how we felt about a plea deal versus going to trial. Victor and I discussed it that night at Dad's house. Part of me wanted to see Diane face a jury and get convicted on every single charge. But the DA explained that trials were risky, juries were unpredictable, and a solid plea deal guaranteed prison time without putting Dad through the stress of testifying at a lengthy trial. We told Prudence we'd support whatever Dad wanted once he was clear-headed enough to make that decision himself. The hearing to void the medical power of attorney and the fraudulent will happened 2 weeks after the charges were filed. Victor and I sat in the courtroom while Prudence presented our evidence to the judge. Dad testified for nearly an hour about how Diane had isolated him from family and friends, controlled all his medications and medical appointments, and presented legal documents for him to sign when he was heavily drugged and disoriented. He spoke clearly and calmly, explaining how the confusion lifted once the drugs were replaced with vitamins, how he'd never actually wanted to marry Diane or cut his children out of his will. The judge asked him specific questions about his mental state when he signed the documents, whether he understood what he was signing, whether anyone explained the legal implications. Dad admitted he barely remembered signing anything, that Diane had told him it was routine paperwork for his medical care. Diane's lawyer tried to argue that Dad had been competent at the time, that his current testimony was influenced by his children's manipulation. The judge shut that down fast after reviewing the camera footage of Diane crushing pills into Dad's food and the medical evidence showing the drug effects. The ruling came immediately. Both documents were void due to clear evidence of fraud and undue influence. Dad's original will remained valid, and Victor and I were restored as his healthcare proxies. The judge also ordered Diane to return all of Dad's property, including Mom's jewelry, within 10 days, or face additional contempt charges. We left the courthouse feeling relieved but exhausted. Dad started seeing a therapist specializing in elder abuse trauma the following week. The counselor had worked with other victims of caregiver exploitation and understood the specific shame and trust issues that came with this type of manipulation. Dad struggled in those early sessions, feeling stupid for being fooled so completely by someone he'd trusted with his daily care. He kept saying he should have known better, should have recognized the signs, should have protected himself. The therapist worked with him on understanding that Diane was a professional predator who'd refined her techniques over years and multiple victims. She'd targeted Dad specifically because he was vulnerable after his stroke, grieving Mom's death and desperate for help managing his recovery. The manipulation wasn't his fault. Victor and I took turns staying at Dad's house while he recovered, neither of us wanting him to be alone yet after months of Diane's control. We were both running on empty after the stress of the investigation and legal proceedings, but seeing Dad improve daily made the exhaustion worthwhile. He was reading the newspaper again every morning, doing crossword puzzles in the afternoon, calling his friends without needing prompting or permission. Small things that showed his mind was working properly again, that he was reclaiming his independence and personality. Darren delivered his complete investigator report a month after Diane's arrest. The full documentation of her previous schemes made for brutal reading. Both previous victims had died within a year of marrying her. One fell down the stairs in his home, which was ruled an accidental death despite the family's suspicions. The other died from medication interactions that seemed like natural causes, until you looked at the pattern of Diane being the only person managing his prescriptions. Both families had suspected something was wrong, but lacked evidence to prove foul play. Diane had moved to different states after inheriting their estates, staying ahead of any serious investigation. The report included financial records showing she'd stolen similar amounts from both men before their deaths, using the same tactics of adding herself to bank accounts and making unauthorized purchases. Detective Flores called us in for an update 2 weeks later. The previous victims' families were considering wrongful death lawsuits now that the criminal case had uncovered Diane's pattern. One family had found their father's original will that Diane had hidden, showing she'd manipulated him into changing it just weeks before his death, exactly like she'd done with Dad. The detective told us bluntly that she believed Diane would have eventually killed Dad too, once the marriage was finalized and all the legal documents were in place. The only reason Dad survived was because we'd caught her before she could complete her plan. That conversation hit hard, realizing how close we'd come to losing him permanently. Dad had a major setback when Lara showed him photos she'd found on social media of Diane wearing Mom's wedding ring. Someone had tagged Diane in old posts from before her arrest, and there she was smiling at the camera with Mom's distinctive sapphire and diamond ring on her finger. Dad became agitated and depressed after seeing those images, saying it felt like Diane had violated not just him, but Mom's memory too. We spent hours reassuring him that we'd get every piece of Mom's jewelry back through the court order, that Diane would face consequences for stealing those precious items. But the emotional wound of seeing this stranger wearing his late wife's treasured ring cut deeper than the financial theft. It took him several days to recover his equilibrium. Ellen used her pharmaceutical industry connections to trace how Diane had obtained the prescription drugs she'd been using on Dad. The investigation led to a pharmacist named Robert Kim, who'd been selling controlled substances under the table for years. Kim got arrested 2 weeks after Diane, facing his own charges for illegal drug distribution. He admitted during questioning that Diane had been buying from him for at least 5 years, confirming she'd used the same scheme multiple times with different victims. The drug enforcement agents were building a case against Kim that would likely result in losing his license and serving prison time. 3 weeks after Diane's arrest, Dad had recovered enough cognitive function that his emotional response shifted from devastation to anger. He told us he wanted to testify at trial, wanted to confront Diane in court, wanted everyone to know exactly what she'd done to him. Prudence warned him that the trial was still months away, and plea deals might prevent him from having that direct confrontation. But Dad was determined to see justice done properly, saying he needed to speak publicly about what happened, so other families would recognize the warning signs. His anger was healthier than the shame he'd been carrying, showing he was processing the trauma and reclaiming his sense of agency. Prudence filed the civil lawsuit against the caregiving agency 3 weeks after Diane's arrest, arguing they'd been negligent in their hiring process and enabled a predator to access vulnerable clients. She dug into their background check procedures and discovered something stunning. The agency never actually verified Diane's glowing references. When Prudence called the phone numbers listed on Diane's application, they all went to burner phones that Diane herself controlled. She'd created fake references, complete with different voices and backstories, and the agency had accepted them without any real verification. They never checked her employment history with previous agencies, never contacted the families she'd supposedly worked for, never did criminal background checks across state lines. Their entire vetting process was basically asking Diane to provide her own references and taking her word that they were legitimate. Prudence said this level of negligence was shocking even by industry standards, and it meant the agency had directly enabled Diane to target Dad and probably other victims too. Meanwhile, Dad's physical therapy sessions were going better than anyone expected. His therapist told us that having a clear purpose, recovering so he could testify against Diane, was motivating him to push harder than most stroke patients. He worked through the exercises with determination, walking longer distances each week, doing strength training, practicing his speech even though the slur had mostly cleared up already. By the 5th week of therapy, he was walking without any assistance, moving around his house freely, even going for short walks around the neighborhood with Victor or me accompanying him. His speech had no remaining slur at all. The therapist said he'd actually surpassed his post-stroke baseline, that he was stronger and more mobile now than he'd been right after the stroke 6 months ago. Dad told me the anger at Diane was fuel, that every time he wanted to quit an exercise he pictured her face and pushed through the pain. 4 weeks after her arrest, Diane's lawyer contacted the DA with another plea offer. She would plead guilty to elder abuse and fraud, serve 8 years in prison, and pay full restitution for everything she'd stolen from Dad. The DA called us in to discuss it since Dad was the primary victim, and his input mattered for the decision. We sat in the DA's office while she explained that 8 years was a reasonable sentence for the charges they could definitely prove, that going to trial always carried risks, that this guaranteed Diane would serve significant time. Dad listened to the whole explanation, and then refused immediately. He wanted her prosecuted for attempted murder. He wanted the previous victims' deaths investigated and charged as murders. He wouldn't let Diane minimize what she'd done by pleading to lesser charges that made it sound like she'd just stolen some money and been a bit pushy. She'd systematically drugged him, isolated him from everyone who cared about him, manipulated legal documents while he was incapacitated, and was clearly planning to kill him once the marriage went through. 8 years wasn't enough, not even close. The families of Diane's previous victims started reaching out to us after Detective Flores contacted them about the criminal case. One daughter named Rebecca called me, and we talked for over an hour about what had happened to her father. She described how he'd changed completely in his final months, becoming confused and paranoid, forgetting his grandchildren's names, accusing family members of stealing from him, exactly like Dad's symptoms. Her father had married Diane after knowing her only 3 months, changed his will to leave her everything, and died 4 months later from what doctors said was a heart attack. Rebecca and her siblings had suspected something was wrong but couldn't prove anything, and Diane had moved to a different state immediately after inheriting their father's estate. Rebecca cried on the phone, telling me she was grateful our evidence finally proved what happened to her dad, even though it was too late to save him. She said at least now she knew the truth, that her father hadn't actually abandoned his family by choice, that he'd been manipulated and drugged just like Dad was. Victor started seeing a therapist to deal with guilt about not recognizing the warning signs earlier. He kept saying we should have been more suspicious when Dad's personality changed so drastically, that we should have pushed harder to get him away from Diane, that we'd wasted months while she poisoned our father. His therapist helped him understand that Diane was a professional predator who'd refined her techniques over years and multiple victims, that she'd had legitimate medical excuses for every symptom, that even doctors and social workers had been fooled by her act. We'd done the best we could with the information we had, and ultimately we had saved Dad by being persistent and creative when the system failed us. The therapist told Victor that guilt was normal, but not productive, that he needed to focus on Dad's recovery and the prosecution, rather than torturing himself about what we might have done differently. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Dad's friends rallied around him once word spread about what Diane had done. People he hadn't seen in months started calling and visiting. apologizing for believing Diane's lies about him needing space and rest. Lara organized a weekly card game at Dad's house that became his social anchor, reminding him he had a community beyond just family. Every Thursday night, 6 of his longtime friends would come over for poker and conversation, and watching Dad laugh and joke with them, telling stories and trash-talking their card skills, showed us how much of himself he'd reclaimed. He was fully present during those games, sharp and funny and engaged, nothing like the confused, distant man Diane had turned him into. The caregiving agency settled our civil lawsuit 2 months after we filed it, agreeing to pay $200,000 rather than face trial and public exposure of their negligent hiring practices. Their insurance company apparently pushed for settlement once they saw Prudence's evidence about the fake references and complete lack of verification procedures. As part of the settlement, the agency had to implement new screening protocols including criminal background checks across all 50 states, in-person verification of references, and regular supervision of caregivers in clients' homes. Prudence said it was too little too late for Dad and the other clients Diane had harmed while working for them, but at least future clients would have better protection. Detective Flores called us 6 weeks after Diane's arrest with another update. Her investigation had uncovered evidence linking Diane to a 4th potential victim in another state, a widower who died 10 years ago under suspicious circumstances. The case had never been thoroughly investigated because the death appeared natural, just an elderly man with health problems who passed away in his sleep. But the pattern matched perfectly. Recent widower, mild cognitive issues, sudden marriage to Diane after 3 months, death within 6 months, Diane inheriting everything and immediately moving away. Flores was working with detectives in that state to see if they could build a case, though she warned us that evidence from 10 years ago would be harder to prove. The grand jury hearing happened 8 weeks after Diane's arrest. Dad testified about the isolation tactics, how Diane had systematically cut him off from friends and family. He described the drugging, the confusion and memory loss that cleared up as soon as we replaced her pills with vitamins. He explained how she'd manipulated him into signing legal documents when he was disoriented and incapacitated, how she'd controlled every aspect of his life while pretending to be his loving caregiver. His voice shook during parts of the testimony, but stayed clear and strong throughout. The grand jury heard from multiple witnesses, including Ellen about the drugs, Darren about his investigation, Detective Flores about the previous victims, and Rebecca about her father's death. They indicted Diane on expanded charges, including 2 counts of second-degree murder for the previous victims, along with the attempted murder, elder abuse, fraud, and theft charges. We finally got Mom's jewelry back 3 months after Diane's arrest, when the judge ordered her to return all stolen property. The police brought it to Dad's house in evidence bags, each piece carefully documented and photographed. Dad broke down completely when he held Mom's wedding ring again, the sapphire and diamond ring she'd worn for 52 years of marriage. He sat at the kitchen table crying, turning the ring over in his hands, remembering their life together, and how Diane had tried to erase that history by wearing Mom's things and posting photos online like she was replacing her. Victor and I sat with him while he processed it, letting him grieve and rage and eventually find some peace in having these precious items back. Later that evening, Dad told us he wanted to give the ring to Victor's daughter when she was older, that he wanted something positive to come from this nightmare, wanted Mom's ring to represent love and commitment rather than theft and violation. 4 months after Diane's arrest, Victor and I took Dad to tour Riverside Senior Community, a place with independent apartments and optional meal service. Dad crossed his arms in the lobby and said he wasn't moving anywhere, that he was perfectly capable of living in his own house. We explained it wasn't about capability, that we worried about him being isolated after everything that happened, that having neighbors his age around might help him feel less alone. He grudged through the tour, barely looking at the apartment with its kitchen and living room, but something shifted when we walked past the common area where a group was playing cards. One man called out asking if Dad played bridge, and Dad admitted he used to play every week before his stroke. The man waved him over to watch a hand, and Dad ended up staying for 2 hours while Victor and I handled the paperwork. By the time we collected him, he'd agreed to move in the following week and had already scheduled himself into the Thursday afternoon card game. The DA called us 3 weeks after Dad settled into Riverside to schedule a meeting about the trial timeline. We drove downtown to her office, a cramped space with case files stacked everywhere, and she explained that Diane's trial date was set for 6 months out. Murder trials required extensive preparation, especially with victims from multiple states and different jurisdictions all needing to coordinate. She had to work with prosecutors in 2 other states, gather all the physical evidence, line up expert witnesses about the drugs and their effects, and prepare testimony from dozens of people who'd interacted with Diane over the years. We'd need patience, but the case was strong with the camera footage, the pills, the pattern of previous victims, and Dad's clear recovery once the drugging stopped. She warned us that Diane's lawyer would try every delay tactic possible, so the 6-month timeline might stretch longer, but she was committed to getting justice for Dad and the families of Diane's previous victims. Dad started volunteering with the Elder Protection Alliance 2 months into his stay at Riverside. The group met twice a month at the community center, bringing in seniors who'd experienced financial exploitation, caregiver abuse, or family manipulation to share their stories and warn others about red flags. Dad was nervous before his first session, telling me he felt embarrassed about being fooled so completely, worried other people would think he was stupid or weak. I reminded him that Diane was a professional predator who'd successfully deceived multiple families, that sharing his experience could literally save someone else's life. He stood up in front of 40 seniors and told them everything, his voice shaking when he described how Diane isolated him from his friends and convinced him his own children were enemies. Several people cried during his story, and afterward 3 different seniors approached him to describe similar situations they'd escaped or were currently trapped in. One woman grabbed his hand and thanked him for making her feel less alone, saying she'd been too ashamed to tell anyone her daughter-in-law was stealing from her. Dad came home energized rather than drained, saying he'd found a purpose in turning his nightmare into protection for others. Victor and I started attending a support group for families of elder abuse victims the following month. We'd both been carrying guilt about not recognizing Diane's manipulation sooner, wondering if we should have pushed harder when Dad first started changing, questioning whether we could have prevented months of his suffering. The group met in a church basement every Tuesday evening, and hearing other families' stories reinforced how common these schemes were and how sophisticated the predators could be. One daughter described her father's caregiver who'd convinced him to add her to his bank accounts within 3 weeks of being hired. Another son talked about his mother's boyfriend who'd isolated her so completely that the family didn't realize she was abused until she ended up in the hospital. Many families shared our exact guilt about not seeing the signs earlier, and the facilitator helped us understand that these predators specifically target people during vulnerable moments and use professional manipulation tactics refined over years. We weren't failures as children. We were dealing with calculated criminals who knew exactly how to exploit both the victims and their families. Ellen got called into her company's regional office 6 weeks after helping us expose Diane. Her pharmaceutical expertise had been crucial to identifying the drug combinations Diane used to create fake dementia symptoms, and her quick thinking about replacing the pills with vitamins had given us time to gather evidence without Diane realizing we were onto her. The company's vice president thanked her personally for helping expose the corrupt pharmacist who'd been selling controlled substances illegally, saying the investigation had uncovered a distribution network supplying multiple caregivers with drugs for elder abuse schemes. They asked Ellen to speak at their national conference about preventing medication abuse in elder care settings, and she'd be developing new training protocols for pharmaceutical reps about recognizing suspicious prescription patterns. She came home with a promotion and a bonus, but told Victor and me that the real reward was knowing Dad was safe, and that her knowledge had protected him when it mattered most. Dad's neurologist scheduled a comprehensive evaluation 4 months after Diane's arrest to assess his cognitive recovery. We drove him to the appointment expecting good news, but still anxious about potential lasting damage from either the stroke or the months of drugging. The doctor put Dad through extensive testing, checking his memory, reasoning, language skills, and executive function. 2 hours later, she told us Dad was fully recovered cognitively, with no lasting effects from either the stroke or Diane's drug cocktail. His brain scans showed no new damage, and his cognitive function had returned to his pre-stroke baseline. She called it a remarkable recovery and asked Dad's permission to use his case in teaching medical students about drug-induced cognitive impairment that mimics dementia. Dad agreed immediately, saying if his nightmare could educate doctors about recognizing when medications are causing symptoms rather than treating them, then something good would come from it. Prudence called us 2 weeks later with news about Diane. Her bail had been revoked after she violated the restraining order by contacting one of the previous victims' families. Diane had somehow gotten the daughter's phone number and called claiming she wanted to apologize, but the call was actually an attempt to intimidate the witness and convince her not to testify. The daughter recorded the entire conversation and took it straight to Detective Flores, who arrested Diane for witness tampering. She'd been sitting in jail for 2 months awaiting trial, which Prudence said actually helped the prosecution since Diane couldn't manipulate witnesses, destroy evidence, or coordinate her defense as effectively from behind bars. The judge had denied bail entirely this time, ruling that Diane had proven herself a danger to witnesses and a flight risk. Dad asked Victor and me to go with him to meet his financial advisor 6 months after Diane's arrest. Robert had managed Dad's investments for 20 years and was horrified when we explained how much Diane had stolen and how she'd manipulated Dad into adding her to his accounts. He pulled up all of Dad's statements and walked us through implementing better security protections. From now on, any transaction over $5,000 would require signatures from both Dad and either Victor or me. Robert would send monthly account summaries to all 3 of us so we'd catch any unusual activity immediately. He set up alerts for any new account access, any attempts to add authorized users, and any changes to beneficiary designations. Dad felt embarrassed needing these safeguards, but Robert reminded him that plenty of competent people get taken advantage of during vulnerable moments, and smart planning meant protecting yourself before problems happened, rather than cleaning up damage afterward. The DA called us 6 months after Diane's arrest to discuss a plea offer. Diane's lawyer had approached her with a final proposal after realizing the evidence against Diane was overwhelming, and a trial would likely result in life without parole. Diane would plead guilty to all charges, including 2 counts of second-degree murder for the previous victims, accept a sentence of 25 years to life, and provide full testimony about her methods and whether anyone had helped her target vulnerable seniors. In exchange, the prosecution would take the death penalty off the table. The DA wanted our input before responding since Dad was the primary surviving victim and his opinion mattered in the decision. She explained that 25 years to life meant Diane wouldn't be eligible for parole until she'd served the full 25 years, making her 73 years old at her earliest possible release. And given the severity of her crimes, the parole board would likely deny her repeatedly. Dad asked Victor and me to meet with him and the DA at her office to discuss the plea offer together. We sat around her conference table while Dad struggled with the decision, his hands shaking slightly as he talked through his conflicting feelings. Part of him wanted to confront Diane at trial, wanted to look her in the eye while testifying about what she'd done to him, wanted a jury to hear every detail of her manipulation and drugging and theft. But another part of him dreaded reliving the worst months of his life publicly, having his confusion and vulnerability displayed in open court, enduring cross-examination from Diane's lawyer trying to make him look incompetent or willing. The DA explained that trials were brutal for victims, that Diane's defense would attack his credibility and suggest he'd been a willing participant in their relationship, that the process could take weeks and re-traumatize him repeatedly. After 2 hours of discussion, Dad took a deep breath and said he'd support the plea. 25 years to life meant Diane would likely die in prison, and he'd be spared months of trial stress and public exposure. He wanted justice, but he also wanted to move forward with his life, and accepting the plea would give him closure without destroying his peace. The plea hearing happened 2 weeks later at the county courthouse. Victor and I sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table while Dad waited in the witness area, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Diane entered in an orange jumpsuit, handcuffed, looking smaller somehow without her caregiver uniform and fake smile. The judge asked if she understood the charges, and she said yes in a flat voice, no emotion at all. Her lawyer stood and confirmed she was pleading guilty to all counts including elder abuse, fraud, theft, and 2 counts of murder for the previous victims. The judge asked Diane directly if anyone forced her to accept this plea, and she said no, that she understood she was giving up her right to trial. Then came Dad's turn to speak. He walked slowly to the witness stand and the bailiff helped him get settled, before the judge asked if he wanted to give a victim impact statement. Dad pulled folded papers from his pocket, his hands shaking as he smoothed them flat. He started reading about how Diane destroyed his trust in people, made him doubt his own mind, stole months of his life that he'd never get back. His voice cracked when he described thinking he had dementia, believing his children had abandoned him, feeling completely alone while she poisoned him 3 times a day. He talked about the shame of being so completely fooled, the fear of losing himself, the anger at having his autonomy stolen. Diane stared at the table the whole time, never looking up, and I wanted to scream at her to at least face him while he spoke. Dad's voice got stronger toward the end when he said she'd nearly killed him but failed, that he'd survived and rebuilt his life, that she'd spend decades in prison while he lived freely with people who actually cared about him. When he finished, the courtroom was completely silent for a moment before the judge thanked him for his courage in speaking. The judge took a short break before sentencing, and when court resumed, she addressed Diane directly about the seriousness of her crimes. She described a pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable seniors, systematic drugging to fake medical conditions, exploitation of trust for financial gain, and 2 murders of previous victims who'd been manipulated exactly like Dad. The judge said the aggravating factors far outweighed any mitigating circumstances, that Diane had shown no remorse and had only accepted the plea to avoid harsher punishment. Then she pronounced the sentence. 25 years to life in state prison with no possibility of parole before serving the full 25 years. Diane would be 73 years old at her earliest parole hearing, and given the severity of her crimes, the judge noted that parole would likely be denied repeatedly. Diane stood there expressionless as the judge finished, and when the bailiffs moved to take her away, she finally glanced back at the courtroom. Her eyes met Dad's for just a second, and there was still no emotion there, no apology or regret, just emptiness. Dad watched her being led through the side door in handcuffs, and I saw his shoulders relax slightly like he'd been holding tension for months and could finally release it. This time there was finality to it. No more court dates or hearings or waiting, just done. Outside the courtroom, a group of people approached us nervously. The previous victims' families had attended the sentencing, and they wanted to thank us for providing the evidence that finally brought Diane to justice. An older woman introduced herself as the daughter of one of Diane's earlier victims, and she started crying as she explained how her father had changed completely in his final months. He'd become confused and paranoid, pushed away his family, married Diane quickly, then died from what seemed like a tragic accident. They'd suspected something was wrong but couldn't prove anything, and Diane had moved to another state with their father's money before they could investigate further. Now, knowing what really happened, she said she could finally grieve her father properly, instead of feeling guilty about not protecting him. A man whose father was Diane's other victim shared a similar story, describing the same pattern of isolation and cognitive decline that we'd witnessed with Dad. He thanked us for being persistent enough to gather real evidence, for not giving up when the system seemed stacked against us, for giving their families answers after years of painful questions. We exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch, bonded by shared trauma and relief that Diane couldn't hurt anyone else's family. Victor told them that Dad would want to talk with them sometime, that knowing he wasn't alone in this experience might help his healing. Dad threw a small celebration dinner at his senior living community 3 days after the sentencing. He'd moved into an apartment there 2 months earlier, wanting the security of having people around while still maintaining his independence. He invited family and close friends, maybe 20 people total gathered in the community's private dining room. It wasn't exactly a party atmosphere because the trauma was too recent, but there was genuine relief and gratitude that he'd survived, and Diane was imprisoned. Lara arrived early and hugged Dad for a long time, apologizing again for believing Diane's lies about him wanting space from friends. Dad kept reassuring her that Diane had fooled everyone, that she was a professional manipulator who'd practiced her techniques on multiple victims. Victor gave a short toast, thanking everyone who'd supported Dad through the investigation and recovery, and then Lara raised her glass to Dad's strength and to family, who never gave up fighting for him. Dad got emotional and had to pause before responding, saying he'd been lucky to have children who trusted their instincts when something felt wrong, who'd spent their own money on private investigators and lawyers, who'd refused to accept that he was simply declining with age. The dinner felt like a turning point, not an ending, but an acknowledgement that the worst was over, and Dad could focus on rebuilding, rather than just surviving. Victor and I gradually reduced our constant presence in Dad's life over the next few months as he showed he was truly stable and safe. It was harder than expected to step back after months of visiting daily, monitoring everything, staying alert for any signs of problems. We'd been in crisis mode so long that normal felt strange and slightly wrong, like we were abandoning him even though logically we knew he needed independence. Dad was the one who finally told us to ease up, saying he appreciated everything we'd done, but needed to prove to himself that he could manage his own life again. We worked out a routine of regular visits and phone calls without hovering, checking in a few times a week instead of daily, letting him make his own decisions about his schedule and activities without our input. It felt like watching him recover wasn't just about his cognitive function returning, but about trusting him to take care of himself again, accepting that he was capable and competent even after everything that happened. 8 months after Diane's sentencing, Dad mentioned he'd been spending time with someone from his card game group. Her name was Margaret, and she was a retired teacher who'd moved into the senior community around the same time Dad did. At first, Victor and I were anxious about him being vulnerable again, worried that he'd trust too easily after what Diane did to him. But when we met Margaret, she was completely different from Diane in every way that mattered. She had her own retirement income and savings, owned her condo outright, had grown children who visited regularly. She'd actually known Dad slightly before Diane ever entered the picture, had been at some of the same community events before his stroke. Margaret was patient with Dad's trust issues, didn't push for anything serious, seemed content to build a genuine friendship first, before considering anything romantic. She told us directly that she understood Dad had been through trauma and needed time, that she wasn't looking to rush into anything or change her own independent life. Dad seemed lighter when he talked about her, mentioning small things like walks they'd taken or books they'd discussed, and it was nice seeing him interested in someone without the desperation or confusion that Diane had exploited. The caregiving agency implemented new screening protocols from our settlement agreement, and Prudence walked us through the changes they'd committed to making. Every caregiver would now undergo criminal background checks in all states where they'd previously worked, not just their current state. References would be verified through in-person or video contact with the actual people listed, not just phone numbers the applicant provided. The agency would assign supervisors to make unannounced visits to clients' homes at least monthly, checking in with both the caregiver and the client separately. They'd also created a confidential hotline where family members could report concerns without going through the caregiver first. Prudence said these changes wouldn't prevent all abuse because determined predators would find ways around any system, but it was significantly better than their previous practices that had basically relied on trusting applicants' self-reported information. The settlement money would fund these improvements for at least 5 years, and the agency had to report compliance data quarterly, or face additional penalties. Dad testified before a state legislative committee about elder abuse protections 9 months after Diane's arrest. A representative who'd heard about his case through news coverage invited him to speak at a hearing about proposed legislation to strengthen oversight of medical power of attorney documents and caregiver licensing requirements. Dad was nervous about speaking publicly, worried about seeming weak or foolish, but Victor and I encouraged him to share his experience if he felt comfortable. His testimony was personal and detailed, describing exactly how Diane had isolated him, manipulated him into signing documents he didn't fully understand, drugged him to create symptoms that justified her control. He talked about how easily the system had failed him, how adult protective services found no evidence of abuse because Diane was careful to maintain appearances, how his own doctors never questioned why his cognitive function declined so rapidly. He advocated for requiring witnesses who weren't connected to the caregiver when someone signed over medical power of attorney, for mandatory reporting when elderly patients showed sudden cognitive decline, for better training to help medical professionals recognize signs of drugging. 2 representatives approached him afterward and committed to sponsoring legislation based on his recommendations, saying his first-hand account made the abstract policy proposals feel urgent and necessary. Victor's daughter asked Dad about what happened with Diane a few weeks after his legislative testimony. She was 10 years old and had heard adults talking about Diane going to prison, about Grandpa being sick but getting better, about bad people who hurt elderly folks. She was confused and a little scared, wondering if Grandpa was still sick or if other bad people might hurt him. Dad sat her down in his apartment and explained in terms she could understand, talking about how some people pretend to be nice but actually want to take advantage of others, especially when those people are going through hard times. He told her about trusting carefully, not sharing personal information with people you don't know well, recognizing when someone tries to separate you from your family and friends. He emphasized that if something ever felt wrong, even if an adult told her it was fine, she should always tell her parents or another trusted adult immediately. Dad turned his trauma into a teaching moment, helping her understand that bad things can happen, but families protect each other, that asking for help isn't weak but smart. She asked if he was scared of Diane coming back, and he said no, that Diane was in prison for a very long time and couldn't hurt anyone anymore, that he'd learned to be more careful, but wasn't going to live in fear. 1 year after Diane's arrest, Dad was genuinely thriving in his senior community. He'd been dating Margaret for 4 months, had gotten involved with the Community Activities Committee, volunteered twice a week with the Elder Advocacy Group helping other abuse survivors, and maintained strong relationships with family and friends. His apartment was decorated with photos of our family, Mom's favorite artwork that he'd reclaimed from storage and new pictures from trips he'd taken with Margaret to local museums and parks. He hosted regular game nights, attended exercise classes, participated in book club discussions. The cognitive effects of Diane's drugging had completely resolved, leaving him as sharp as he'd been before his stroke, maybe even more engaged because he'd confronted his own vulnerability and chosen to live fully anyway. He still had moments of anger about the lost time and violation of trust, still occasionally had nightmares about being confused and helpless, but those moments were becoming less frequent as he built new positive experiences that overshadowed the trauma. Victor and I visited every couple weeks, called regularly, but no longer felt the need to monitor his every move or worry constantly about his safety. Dad had reclaimed his autonomy and used it well, proving that surviving something terrible didn't mean letting it define the rest of your life. Several months later, a thick envelope arrived from the state appeals court, with the official notice that Diane's appeals had been denied. Her lawyers had argued the confession was coerced and the 25-year sentence was excessive, but the appeals court rejected both claims and found no merit in any of her arguments. The conviction and sentence were final now, meaning she would serve her full 25 years minimum before even being eligible for parole. Dad called us immediately after reading the notice, and his voice sounded lighter than it had in months, like he'd been carrying weight he could finally put down. He said knowing Diane couldn't file more appeals or find some legal loophole to reduce her time gave him real peace, that this final legal closure meant he could stop looking over his shoulder and focus completely on rebuilding his life. A few weeks after the appeal denial, Dad and Margaret packed up his car and drove out west to visit national parks, something Dad had always wanted to do, but never felt confident attempting after his stroke. They spent 10 days hiking easy trails, taking photos at scenic overlooks, and staying in small motels along the way. Dad sent us pictures from the Grand Canyon showing him standing at a viewpoint in hiking boots and a sun hat, looking healthy and genuinely happy in a way we hadn't seen since before Mom died. There were photos of him and Margaret at Zion, at Bryce Canyon, at Monument Valley, each one showing Dad more relaxed and engaged with the world around him. Victor and I looked through the photos together and agreed that seeing Dad reclaim his life and confidence like this was the best possible outcome we could have hoped for after everything he'd survived. When Dad returned from the trip, the Elder Advocacy Group contacted him about leading a new support program for abuse survivors, pairing him with others who'd experienced similar exploitation by caregivers or family members. He was hesitant at first when they called, worried about re-traumatizing himself by constantly discussing what Diane had done, and concerned he wasn't qualified to counsel others through their recovery. But the program coordinator explained they wanted survivors to support each other, not professional therapists, and that Dad's public testimony and advocacy work had inspired other victims to come forward and seek help. Dad agreed to try it for 3 months and found that helping others process their experiences actually aided his own healing in unexpected ways. Listening to other people's stories reminded him he wasn't alone in being targeted, and offering practical advice about legal protections and recognizing warning signs gave him purpose beyond just recovering himself. Around the same time Dad started the support program, Victor and I began attending therapy together to process our own trauma from watching Dad's decline and fighting to save him. We'd both been so focused on Dad's recovery that we hadn't dealt with our own guilt about not recognizing Diane's scheme sooner, or the stress of those months when we felt helpless to protect him. The therapist helped us understand we were dealing with a sophisticated predator who'd refined her tactics over years and multiple victims, that Diane had deliberately exploited normal family dynamics and our trust in medical professionals. She pointed out that we did recognize something was wrong and took action as soon as we had evidence, that many families in similar situations never figure it out at all. The sessions helped Victor and me support each other better too, since we'd both been carrying different pieces of guilt and anger that we hadn't fully shared with each other. 18 months after Diane's sentencing, Dad called us over to his apartment and nervously told us he'd proposed to Margaret and she'd said yes. This time Victor and I were thrilled rather than horrified, hugging Dad and congratulating him without any of the dread we'd felt when Diane announced their supposed engagement. Margaret was completely transparent about everything, showing us the prenuptial agreement keeping their finances separate, involving us in the wedding planning from the start, and making sure Dad's will and legal documents properly protected everyone. She insisted on meeting with Prudence to review all the paperwork, and wanted Victor and me to approve everything before they signed anything. The contrast to Diane's manipulation was stark and deeply reassuring, showing us that Margaret understood our protective instincts and respected them, rather than trying to separate Dad from his family. The wedding day arrived on a sunny Saturday afternoon at the senior community's garden area, with close family and friends gathered for the small ceremony. Dad was nervous that morning, adjusting his tie repeatedly and asking Victor if he looked okay. But once the ceremony started, he was radiantly happy in a way that made my chest tight with gratitude. Margaret's children welcomed Dad warmly into their family, and her daughter gave a short speech about how Dad had brought joy back into her mother's life after years of loneliness. Watching Dad dance with his new wife during the reception, both of them laughing and moving slowly to old love songs, I felt grateful he'd survived to have this second chance at companionship, and that we'd fought hard enough to make this moment possible. 3 months after the wedding, the state legislature passed the Elder Protection Act, based partly on Dad's testimony and advocacy work over the previous year. The new law required stricter oversight of caregivers through mandatory background checks and reference verification, imposed criminal penalties for financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, and created a reporting system for suspicious medical power of attorney transfers. Dad attended the bill signing ceremony at the state capitol, standing behind the governor as she signed the legislation, and thanking the representatives who'd championed the bill through committee hearings and floor debates. Several other abuse survivors attended too, and Dad introduced us to people he'd been working with through the support program, all of them committed to preventing what happened to them from happening to others. In the months that followed the bill signing, Dad and Margaret settled into married life that worked for both of them, splitting time between their separate apartments and taking weekend trips together to museums, theaters, and local parks. Dad told us one evening over dinner that Margaret made him feel safe in a way he couldn't have imagined after Diane, that she encouraged his independence instead of trying to control him, included his family in their lives instead of isolating him, and respected his need to sometimes process his trauma privately, without taking it personally. He said learning to trust again had been harder than recovering from the drugging, but Margaret's patience and transparency had helped him believe not everyone wanted to take advantage of him. 2 years after Diane's arrest, Dad had fully reclaimed his life and identity in ways that went beyond just recovering what he'd lost. He was healthy and active, maintaining friendships old and new, happily married to someone who genuinely cared about him, and actively helping other abuse survivors through the support program he now co-directed. The trauma would always be part of his story, something that shaped how he approached relationships and evaluated people's intentions, but it no longer defined him or limited what he could do. He'd rebuilt trust carefully and intentionally, learning to protect himself while still remaining open to connection, and he lived fully rather than fearfully. Looking back now, Victor and I sometimes talk about how close we came to losing Dad, not to his stroke or any natural cause, but to a predator who nearly succeeded in her scheme to drug him, marry him, and eventually kill him for his money. We're grateful for so many people who made his survival possible, starting with Ellen's pharmaceutical knowledge that identified the drugs Diane was using, Darren's investigation skills that uncovered her pattern of previous victims, Prudence's legal expertise that navigated the complex elder abuse laws, and Detective Flores's commitment to prosecuting these cases, even when they're difficult to prove. Dad's survival required a team effort, and honestly some luck. The luck that Victor thought to hire an investigator. When we did, that Ellen knew exactly which drug combinations to look for, that we acted before Diane's plans progressed to the point where Dad might not have recovered. We learned that protecting vulnerable people takes vigilance, resources, and people willing to believe something's wrong, even when surface appearances suggest everything's fine. Dad told us one evening over dinner at his apartment that surviving what Diane did taught him things about himself he never expected to learn at 77 years old. He said he always thought asking for help meant being weak, that needing people showed you couldn't handle your own life anymore. But going through the drugging and manipulation and then the recovery afterward showed him that letting family help actually made him stronger, not weaker. He talked about how isolated he'd felt when Diane was controlling everything, how she convinced him that Victor and I only cared about his money and his friends were too much trouble. Being cut off from everyone who genuinely cared about him was the worst part, worse than the confusion from the drugs or the fear when he realized what she'd done. Now he's closer to both of us than he was before his stroke happened, calls us multiple times a week just to talk, invites us over for dinner with Margaret, includes us in decisions about his life instead of trying to handle everything alone. He said learning that being open about needing support doesn't damage relationships. It actually makes them deeper and more real when you're surrounded by people who truly care about your well-being instead of what they can take from you. We gathered for Dad's 78th birthday celebration at his senior community 3 months after he and Margaret got married, and the party room was packed with people who'd supported him through everything. Margaret and her 2 sons were there, along with Victor and Ellen and their kids, my family, Lara and the other friends from his card game group. Even Prudence stopped by to wish him well. Dad stood up to give a toast, and his voice was steady and strong as he thanked everyone for helping him not just survive Diane's scheme, but actually thrive afterward. He said the experience taught him that even when predators target vulnerable people, strong communities can protect and heal if everyone watches out for each other and speaks up when something feels wrong. He raised his glass to second chances, to family bonds, to friends who stick around through hard times, and to proving that life can be genuinely good again, even after someone tries to destroy it. Life isn't perfect now. Dad still has moments where he struggles with trust or gets anxious about people's intentions, but watching him surrounded by people who love him, married to someone who respects his independence, actively helping other abuse survivors through his advocacy work, it's clear he's rebuilt something real and lasting from the ruins Diane left behind. Well, that's the epic conclusion of pure mediocrity. If you're still watching, you've got commitment issues and I respect that. Subscribe and let's make this bad habit official. Rec.